What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. It's been a busy week. Let's jump in. On Wednesday, the Beijing-based National Bureau of Statistics released China's GDP data for the second quarter, as well as other key economic numbers. GDP, gross domestic product, officially grew by 1.3% quarter on quarter, higher than the first quarter, but still below the 1.6% average Q2 growth rate over the previous 5 years, excluding 2020, and a little below market expectations for the second quarter this year. There has been some rebalancing of domestic demand, but still not enough. Nominal retail sales growth, a good proxy for domestic consumption in the People's Republic, increased up in 2-year annualized terms to 4.9% in June from 4.5% in May. However, it remains far from the pre-COVID rate of 7 to 8%. Remember, it is consumption growth that Beijing wants, and this is critical to the so-called dual circulation model and the rebalancing of the economy that the party has said is a priority for future sustainable growth in China. The official data also shows that total leverage, that is debt, seems to be stabilizing in this quarter at least. Total social financing, this is all non-financial sector debt in the economy, grew by 2.3% in the second quarter versus 3.5% in the first quarter. However, we expected that as pent-up demand from 2020 was released, that we would see a temporary slowdown in the increase of leverage or debt in the economy, as healthy demand-driven growth would mean lower quality infrastructure investment would not be needed to hit growth targets. The consensus regarding the next 6 months for economists is that further GDP growth cooling is on the cards. If 2-year annualized growth of 5.5% represents the new trend for China, and the output remains unchanged for the next few months, year-on-year GDP growth could fall to 6% in the third quarter and below 5% in the fourth quarter. We will see whether Beijing is serious about getting debt under control, or whether it will become nervous when it sees quarterly growth below 5% and open back up the credit taps to maintain a politically acceptable level of growth. We know that Beijing does not have one mind on this matter. We've been following on here the intense and sometimes public debate over whether Beijing should worry more about rising debt or slowing growth. And it is hard to say at this point which side has won that debate. We will just have to wait and see. This week, the Party Central Committee and the State Council issued new guidelines to, quote, strengthen and improve its ideological and political work, end quote. According to state media in the mainland, the document stressed the importance of ideological and political work, saying it had, quote, significant bearing on the party's future, the country's long-term law and order, and the unity and cohesion of the Chinese nation, end quote. It also expressed, quote, ideological work should be regarded as an important tool to govern both the party and the country, end quote. Last week, we discussed the establishment of new Xi Jinping Thought Research Centers, with the 2 new Xi Jinping Thought Research Centers on the economy and ecology being established last week. With the establishment of those 2 research centers, it brings the total of such Xi Jinping Thought Centers in Beijing to 18. In past videos, we have touched on some aspects of ideology in the People's Republic, whether on economics or so-called ethnic unity or party discipline. I believe it is important to familiarize ourselves with ideology in the PRC, as it is increasingly clear that these are not just empty words when they talk about this political or ideological rhetoric, but something that is affecting policy and the culture in the country. So we will continue following developments in ideology on here. One more thing while we're on ideology, this is a statement that was published this week by the Ministry of Education. Quote, in order to further promote Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era into teaching materials, classrooms, and students' minds, the Ministry of Education has organized and compiled the student reader of Xi Jinping Thought of Socialism with Chinese Characteristics in the New Era. Beginning in the fall semester of 2021, primary and secondary schools across the country will use the reader. End quote. And here is one image that was released by state-run media showing some of these books that will be teaching ideology to secondary and primary school children. As of the filming of this, there has been no news of a meeting between US President Joe Biden and Chinese General Secretary Xi Jinping. Typically, meetings between high officials on both sides is a preliminary step towards this happening, but in the current political environment between the two sides, this has been difficult to achieve. This week, US media was reporting that a source or multiple sources had said that the US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman would be meeting with China's Foreign Vice Minister Xie Feng in Tianjin, a city about an hour from Beijing, to discuss the possibility of a meeting between US Secretary of State Blinken and the PRC Foreign Minister Wang Yi, which in turn could pave the way for a meeting between the heads of states. As of late Thursday, the US State Department was reporting that the Deputy Secretary would be traveling to Japan, the Republic of Korea, and Mongolia from July 18th through to July 25th, with no mention of the People's Republic of China. Then the following day, on Friday, several US media outlets reported that the Deputy Secretary of State meeting would not happen because, quote, China refused to agree to a meeting with Le Yucheng, her counterpart, end quote. If this is indeed the case, and that's a big if, it's interesting that this isn't the first time a meeting hasn't happened between officials in the US and China over the last 12 months due to Chinese refusals to provide an appropriate counterpart for the US official. Earlier this year, it leaked that the US Secretary of Defense was having difficulty meeting with his counterpart in the PRC for similar reasons. So with all of this, if and when Xi and Biden meet is still very much unknown at this point. Local Taiwan media is reporting that for the second time in recent weeks, a US military plane landed in Taipei this week. Taiwan media reports that the plane had no passengers on board, but there was a, quote, package that was delivered, end quote. The mainland, of course, as we would expect, was not very pleased. Quote, the Chinese People's Liberation Army can expel, fire warning shots, or even shoot down foreign military aircraft that trespass upon China's airspace. Chinese military observers warned Thursday after a second US Air Force plane landed on the island of Taiwan in less than 2 months, end quote. On Tuesday, the US Secretary of State On Tuesday, the US Department of State issued an updated Xinjiang Supply Chain Business Advisory to highlight the heightened risks for businesses with supply chain and involvement links to Xinjiang, given, quote, the entities are complicit in forced labor and other human rights abuses there and throughout China, end quote. The advisory from the US Department of State stated, quote, given the severity and the extent of these abuses, businesses and individuals that do not exit supply chains, ventures and or investments connected to Xinjiang could run a high risk of violating US law, end quote. The advisory lists 4 areas where US firms may be working with entities engaged in human rights violations. They include assisting in the development of surveillance tools for the Chinese government, sourcing labor or goods from Xinjiang or regions that use its products, applying American technology to Xinjiang-based entities, and aiding the government in the construction and operation of detention centers in the region. On Wednesday, in response to a question about a recent US State Department report to Congress about the situation in Xinjiang, People's Republic of China Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian made a statement that became trending on the Chinese internet that and the following day. His response was, quote, would you like to hear a joke? In this US report are the following words: this administration will defend and protect human rights around the world. How hilarious. The US government has a deplorable human rights record that continues throughout history to this very day. Some in the US are in the habit of giving prescriptions to others when it is them themselves who are really sick. A report following such absurd logic is completely worthless. End quote. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the content. Don't forget to hit that like button if you do get some value from it. As a new YouTube channel discussing relatively sensitive material. This is not exactly promoted heavily by YouTube, but by hitting that like button, it tells the algorithm that it is real content coming from a real creator. And I wanted to take this opportunity to just say a big thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys rock. Thank you so much for all your support over the last year to 2 years. It's really humbling. Okay, let's continue. At a press conference this week, Zhao Yingmin, Vice Minister of the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, said that China's emissions trading scheme will be launched this month, and it will initially involve more than 2,200 power plants across the country. According to Chinese state media outlet Caixin, multiple analysts expect the initial price of carbon credits traded on the national market to be set around 50 RMB, approximately $7 to $8 per ton. The average price is expected to rise to 52 RMB per ton by 2022, 71 RMB per ton by 2025, and 93 RMB, approximately $14 to $15 per ton by 2030. Carbon credits to be traded won't be allowed to rise or fall more than 10% in a daily session, according to recently published regulations, and the maximum size of a single transaction will be less than 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And what has caused quite a strong reaction in the People's Republic of China, WHO Chief Dr. Tedros told reporters that this week that a previous World Health Organization statement to rule out the theory that the virus may have escaped from a lab in Wuhan was quote-unquote premature, expressing, quote, "I was a lab technician myself. I was an immunologist. I've worked in the lab, and lab accidents happen. It's common," end quote. He expressed that the World Health Organization is, quote, "asking China to be transparent, open, and cooperate, especially on the information, raw data that we asked for in the early days of the pandemic," end quote. The Chinese side, which is not very happy, has said that China has been open and transparent from the beginning and rejects the statement from the World Health Organization chief. On Wednesday, Chinese state media reported that the Chinese embassy in Pakistan had confirmed, quote, 9 Chinese nationals and 3 Pakistani nationals were killed in a blast in Pakistan on Wednesday morning, end quote. Later that day, the Chinese Foreign Ministry in Beijing spoke on the accident, saying, quote, "China is shocked by and condemns the bomb blast in Pakistan, which caused Chinese casualties," end quote. However, there was some confusion when on the same day the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Pakistan made the following statement, quote, "This morning a bus carrying Chinese workers plunged into a ravine after a mechanical function resulting in leakage of gas that caused a blast. Further investigations are underway," end quote. In a tweet the following day, Pakistan's information minister tweeted, quote, "Terrorism cannot be ruled out," end quote. Then on Friday, Pakistan finally confirmed the bus explosion was the result of a terrorist attack. Now, there is a bigger issue here that we need to think about for China. With increasing Chinese investment in the region and the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, these incidents may increase more and more into the future and put strain on the PRC's relations with regional actors. And more importantly, it's going to force Beijing to think about how much interventionism it is willing to engage in what is very much a sensitive and complex region, to put it mildly, with billions of dollars of investments tied to politically powerful Chinese SOEs, state-owned enterprises, as well as thousands of Chinese nationals at risk. Beijing will need to make complex, difficult, and potentially expensive decisions. Here is a tweet from the editor-in-chief of the state-run Global Times, a more nationalistic outlet of the state-run outlets in the mainland, just to give an idea of the possible actions up for debate in Beijing. Quote, "The cowardly terrorists behind this attack dare not show up until now, but they will definitely be found out and must be exterminated. If Pakistan's capability is not enough, with its consent, China's missiles and special forces can be put into action," end quote. Now, last week we started with Japan. This week, let's end with Japan. Last week, we discussed the recent statement by Japanese Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso regarding Taiwan. I'll remind you what he said. He said, quote, "If a major problem took place in Taiwan, it would not be too much to say that it could relate to a survival-threatening situation for Japan, end quote. That is to say, if Beijing was in danger, it would be viewed as a situation whereby Japan is permitted to exercise its right of collective self-defense under its constitution. This statement came a week after the Japanese Deputy Defense Minister said at a separate event that Taiwan had to be protected as, quote, a democratic country, end quote. Last week I said it was highly unlikely that these statements were random slips of the tongue. Now it looks certain that they were indeed no gaffes and that they were signaling to Beijing. On Tuesday of this week, Japan's Defense Ministry published its 2021 Defense White Paper and presented it to the Japanese cabinet. The report mentions Taiwan for the first time, stating, quote, stabilizing the situation surrounding Taiwan is important for Japan's security and the stability of the international community, end quote. The white paper also mentions that China has increased and intensified military activities around Taiwan. Now let's take a look at what the Japanese media themselves are reporting. Japanese newspaper Nikkei Asia reported, quote, Defense Minister Nobio Kishi wrote the preface for the paper in a rare move, saying Japan would collaborate with such countries as Australia, Britain, Canada, France, Germany, India, New Zealand, and the United States that share the same value to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific, an initiative apparently aimed at countering China's rising assertiveness, end quote, and went on to say, quote, the Taiwan issue was raised in the white paper to show that concerns are voiced in the Japan-US leaders' communique remain intact, said Takeshi Yuzawa, a professor of international relations of East Asia at Hosei University, end quote. I think the following two brief quotes best encapsulate the mainstream reaction from the PRC to this white paper being published this week in Japan. Quote, China must and will definitely realize complete unification, which is the best scenario for the region's peace and security, end quote. And the second quote from state-run Global Times, quote, Japan should understand that the US could run away if it loses, but Japan is too close to China. There is nowhere it can run, end quote. Okay guys, that's China Update for this week. Don't forget to throw your comments down below. I always love to hear from you guys. As always, wherever you are, I hope you're keeping safe and keeping sane. I will see you next time on China Update.